Hello, Reading League. So we've got a couple people joining. We've got some people
Awesome.
joining in.
Well, welcome everyone. We're excited to be here today to find out how your day has been and also hopefully give you some tips for aligning your instruction with true science of reading practices.
We are so excited to be here today, and we'd love for you to put in the chat where you're joining from.
Absolutely.
We'll give you a second to get acclimated with that typing if you've been just listening today. You can also share. All right, Amy. Amy, number one in there, Rome, New York.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
And we know you, we hope you've had an exciting day. We're not sure what everyone's done because I know there's been options and
Yeah, what a great conference to attend with all of the options. And we're happy you've chosen this as an option as well.
That's right.
So it looks like we have coast to coast here.
Excellent.
And so we will go ahead as you all are signing in and share our screens, and we'll tell you a little bit about ourselves as well. And so let me go ahead and do that.
Megan's going to share the screen today.
That's right. And we'll go ahead and get started. And if you are joining us, signing in last minute in the chat, we'd love to know where you're joining us from.
We also want to share that this session is being recorded. So for those of you that are on that have colleagues or others that you may be familiar with that want to hear it, it will be sent out. We have a Q&A. You're probably so familiar with the Zoom environment that I probably don't need to say this, but there's a Q&A button at the bottom. If you want to post your questions there, that's a great place to have them so that we have the record of them. And if we can't answer that, or if we need an email, we can definitely send you something if we have to. But you can use the chat too. We love teachers sharing in the chat.
Absolutely. And so we'll go ahead and get started. You know, we've shared, we've gotten to know who you are, but we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves. And Karen, I'll kick us off. My name is Megan Mobear. I am an early childhood educator from South Louisiana. I have experience teaching from grades pre-K through 2, and it's actually through implementing Amplify's core program, core instruction program, that I came to learn about the science of reading. So I actually had a backwards approach with implementing a program and wondering, whoa, what are these differences and why? And that was kind of before the science of reading was like a buzzword. And so the interesting thing is I joined Amplify's team and have really gotten to dive deeply into the science of reading. And it's through this journey that I've met my colleague, Karen, AKA Shirley, and I'm Laverne. And she also, we've really gotten to dive deeply into this research that really helps us to make informed decisions and reevaluate our instructional practices, especially since, you know, we have that capacity to do that in today's world with this whole science of reading movement. And I'll tell you this, Karen, a couple of years ago, before the pandemic, I attended the Reading League conference up in Syracuse in the fall. And it was such a vibrant atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
The teachers were so enthusiastic about responding to the call to action to implement science-based reading practices. And I hope one day we get to experience this on site again. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn that over to you now.
I agree with you, Megan. I mean, just the excitement around the Reading League in Indiana. I'm actually from Indiana, so that kind of segues to sharing a little bit about me. In Indiana, we've started a state chapter as well, and I see that happening across the country, and I know you do as well. I'm from Crown Point, Indiana, if anyone's ever heard of that. And I taught first grade and fifth grade, middle school language arts, as well as pre-service educators. But like Megan, I kind of probably came to this in a little bit of a different way. And once I saw CKLA in action in the field, in classrooms, working with teachers, the impact of high quality instructional materials that meet that are based on the science of reading, that science of reading is such a critical piece that all people need to understand, so all of our kiddos can learn to read. And so we are here to share with you today, and I'm excited to dig a little bit deeper into that. And so, we're going to start with the latest research there around that science of reading, and then talking about it in action. Megan's going to really look at that foundational skills aspect of, well, we'll talk about Scarborough's rope, and I'm going to look at the knowledge building and that language or a language comprehension. And we'll take your questions at the end, but please, and we won't keep you all day today. We know we've got another session here coming up.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Karen, we always want to know about, who's joining us, but this is a really big piece because, in the chat, you may want to share how familiar you are with the science of reading. So maybe you're coming today as an expert. Maybe you have attended this session because you're just starting your science of reading journey. Maybe you're trying to be the thought leader in your district who desperately needs to learn about the research behind how, this body of growing research behind how the brain learns how to read. So in the chat, if you could rate yourself as a 5 being an expert and a 1 being today is my introduction, maybe a 3 being I've had some exposure and I'm just ready to learn more. We'd love to know where you're at on your journey.
I just want to put that in the chat. All right.
You're welcome. Yes. Oh my goodness. I love that it's your introduction. We have some mid 3s. Karen, I don't know about you. I'd probably rate myself a 4. I could never rate myself an expert.
I feel the same way because I feel every time we listen to one of the Amplify Science of Reading podcasts from Susan Lambert, some of you are probably familiar with what Megan's going to share that right now, because that's the kind of thing that tells me that I'm not someone that knows it all. And I know that we need to keep learning.
Well, and I think just the point about this body of research that's just continuing to grow, especially with the advances in technology, especially as we reflect with an open mind and really an open heart to look at our past, NAEP data as a whole as a country and see that what we've been doing for decades just really hasn't been working. And we are in a place that is such an exciting, it's such an exciting time because we actually have the ability and the this new knowledge of how to really make the shift, or maybe we're really on that journey. And so obviously over the past year or two, there's really been this call to action, not only with our Science of Reading podcast. These are all articles or tech, books that have been published, or just really this call to action, that we do have to make that shift. And on top of that, we actually have COVID, right? Like we all know this pandemic problem. And, typically in previous years, 50% of first graders, were not only an additional 50% of first graders were not only behind, but in need of intensive support. So if your school had 100 at-risk students in grade 1 at the beginning of the year, it now has about 150. So, this instruction loss is daunting. And then we can further go into NAEP data. So we've had this problem for a while, right? And so thankfully we're all here because it is about the science of reading. It is learning how to take what we know about the science of reading and actually apply some instructional strategies, or maybe reevaluate your current curricula to understand what's missing, right? What are these shifts? Because Karen, we talked about this morning, once you know, right, you have to do better. There's no going back. And so we'll really start here. And Karen's actually going to level set here with the simple view of reading, which I'm sure you've heard about today.
What exactly? If you've been at the conference, you definitely have heard about Philip Goff and William Tundner's work around that simple view of reading. Those two. So when you look at this equation, and we love to remind people of that little multiplication symbol in there, we have 2 aspects, 2 sets of competencies that kids need to develop. And those need to happen across time. And we're going to start with that language comprehension. That language comprehension starts when we're really young, early, from get-go. We are born with that ability. And we develop that our entire lives. The word recognition that Megan's going to really dig into is they're discrete set of skills that kids learn, or whoever learns them and applies them. Once you learn them, you've got them, right? But those don't change over time. That's a discrete set of skills. So if we have a 0 in either one of those boxes, I know we've got literacy folks on the call, and you might not be the math, but I bet you know that we're not going to have much happening in that reading proficiency box. So we need both of those competencies to be developed over time to have proficient readers. One without the other isn't going to cut it. We need both, and there's got to be an equal balance, right? So
Yeah.
So definitely, go ahead, Megan.
Well, and I was just thinking, Karen, what you're saying, that equal balance. I mean, this is the starting point for really reevaluating your current practices, right? Am I even placing an equal emphasis on both developing word recognition and language comprehension?
Exactly.
And that kind of takes us here, right? So we can look at those two main components, but really expand on them to better understand what they are. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to kind of unpack in a really accessible, brief way of some key identifiers to making sure that you are developing these competencies in K-2 in a, to further, to strengthen those strands and make sure they're integrating by 3-5 so that students are on that path to proficiency or reading proficiently. And so Karen, I know you do such a beautiful job at language comprehension. And so I'll let you kick this off with that, and then I'll dive into word recognition.
All right. So we are going to look at that top half of Hollis Scarborough's rope that we just shared with you, that language comprehension. We're going to build knowledge around a variety of topics that, kids are going to acquire the wonderful range of vocabulary, those verbal reasoning skills, understanding that language, the function of it, and making meaning of text. And so it's going to enable our kiddos to make those connections, because we didn't even really talk about the right-hand side of the rope where that productive struggle happens and kids are building that deeper knowledge on those topics and applying it then. And that's really a critical piece. And so it kind of leads up to each one of those strands. And, we're going to have 2 keys to unlock this door for kiddos. And language comprehension, that top half of Scarborough's rope is really the top, is really that first part, that first key. As I shared earlier, as babies, we immediately start to understand that language. And unless we have some kind of auditory issue, we're going to internalize the process. It becomes the receptive language that we're building, and it becomes our expressive language. And so here, we look at the vocabulary that kids are building, those structure of sentences, how the syntax, all of those kinds of things. And we're going to build all of this, all of our lives, through oral language, through what we hear. And so, if our kids don't have that, aren't getting those things, that puts them really at a big disadvantage in terms of putting that to text and to print and producing that language. We can't expect kiddos to do it if we never give them the opportunities and they're not exposed to that. And I saw that lacking in my classrooms. And as Megan shared, we both shared, it's all about the balance. We need a balance.
Yeah. And I'm sure that everyone can think of those kids who come with that deficit already into those earlier grades. And as Karen mentioned, there are 2 keys to really unlocking the way to reading. And Karen just kind of gave a brief overview of the top strand, and we'll really look at the bottom strand now, which is word recognition. So when I talk about word recognition today, when you hear the words word recognition, this is the ability to lift words or text off of the page and recognize those words correctly and automatically. In order to develop word recognition, you have to be able to understand that language is made up of sounds, and that those sounds are actually connected to print or their symbolic representations or their sound spellings when they're represented on paper. And that has to be so automatic that as you're reading and decoding words, lifting the words off the page, it becomes effortless. But unlike language comprehension, the top strand that Karen just kind of hit on, word recognition is not developed naturally. And so this really is what makes teaching a child to decode so complex. In fact, according to science and what we know about how the brain learns how to read and how it's developed at birth, our brains aren't naturally wired to read. It really takes explicit systematic instruction to develop this component of reading. So I'm going to be taking a deep dive into word recognition and really how to identify those key characteristics of how you can make this shift in your classroom based, with your instructional, your instruction, maybe currently, maybe tweaking some things, or if you're a district or a school who's really just looking to make this shift, this year or next, we can start to really build some capacity for making informed decisions when you are looking at curricula. And so we'll go back to this, right? What does this classroom instruction look like when it's really grounded in reading science? What should you be doing as the teacher? What should your students be doing as students? And so we'll actually start with that bottom strand. This is developing word recognition. Again, this is about foundational skills. So as we start decomposing this strand, structured literacy is really that maybe something that's familiar to you, maybe not, but just keep in mind, this is all about word recognition. And going back to the brain, like I know as a teacher, I had to understand the why. And for me, some things weren't apparent, right? Like I'd teach some phonics haphazardly. I'd have these, decodable texts that were 60% decodable or maybe leveled readers. And like, what's not clicking for my students, right? And so basically what scientists or researchers have identified is that, as Karen mentioned, we start to develop language from birth. And so if you're touching, your left side of your brain in the middle, that's actually your speech center. But if you're touching the back side of your brain, that's where your vision center is located. And so when a child actually, if I'm just talking and not reading, then the only part of my brain that's activated is the speech center. But if I'm looking at print and I'm reading it, I need to see those connect. You'll actually see neurons firing between the two centers. And so for kids, think about a baby, that vision center in the back, that's looking at objects is really easy for kids, right? Looking at objects in print, whether it be their mom or dad's face, that recognition of those specific objects. But when we start introducing letters and sounds, are kids able to really connect print to speech here? And so in between those two centers, the vision center and the speech center, lies this really critical switchboard. And if you don't have that switchboard, you're not a reader, bottom line. If you have it, you can read. And so this area, those pathways in between the speech and vision center, is called the visual word form area. And so when we think about word recognition, why are foundational skills, explicit systematic foundational skills, so important to every child in your classroom? It really is about developing that circuit or that switchboard known as the visual word form area. So that way the brain has the ability to transfer written words or text or print into speech, whether it's actually spoken or not. And so that absence of that circuit is really what makes learning to decode words an unnatural process, and why, as I mentioned, using explicit systematic foundational skills instruction is just absolutely key and vital for so many. So we'll level set. What is explicit? Well, explicit is you as the teacher explicitly stating what your kids are going to learn. For example, boys and girls, we're going to learn about the t sound in the word today. And it's represented by the letter T, obviously. That direct instruction is more effective than the discovery method because it doesn't rely on prerequisite skills that may elude some students given their different literacy experiences. So even with thinking about phonemic awareness, right? How many kindergartners do we assume have the explicit instruction for phonemic awareness because they may be reading by sight? But it even goes back to that. We have to make sure we're providing that explicit instruction. But being systematic actually means that we're going to follow a continuum from easier to more complex skills as we slowly introduce those new skills to build on what's already known. So this actually makes, learning more obvious and easier for readers to connect to what's familiar. And then we'll have to review and have that repetitious cycle to give students the opportunity to develop mastery over those skills. And so I'll actually ask you to put yes or no in the chat. Are you currently using an explicit systematic phonics program or foundational skills program in your school? So we'll see who is going to respond here. Are you currently using an explicit systematic foundational skills program in your school? So
All
it
right.
looks like we have a lot of yeses, and this is our 2 yeses so far. We have 1 no, and you know what? We're all here because we can all take away something from this. We want to make sure that our explicit systematic instruction is truly grounded in these kind of key characteristics we're going to identify, but also if you're not, then this can give you another kind of next step. So something we can also share in the chat with you is the Science of Reading Making the Shift ebook, right? So how can we really evaluate our program or our current practices to make sure that we are developing word recognition one strand at a time? And so that first strand in the word recognition strand is phonological awareness. So when we think about phonological awareness, this is all about sounds, right? We want to introduce sounds orally to kids. We need kids to be able to rhyme, right? Or, blend or segment syllables, that being that most simple phonological awareness skill. We want to make sure that kids can also orally blend and segment words, right? So what does that oral blending and segmenting look like? We need to look at that here. And so what we do want to avoid when we think about systematic, moving from most simple to more complex skills, is the day that kids enter kindergarten, do we want to start using phonics, or should we begin with phonological awareness? And this is the place that we should start, right? And so if we think about instructional activities that would actually develop phonological awareness, it may be, gross motor motions to develop skills like syllabication, like cupcake. It may be using cards to blend sounds into words like sun, or using those gross or fine motor motions to develop those skills that, like blending and segmenting, that are going to lead to decoding or encoding, right? Blending would lead to decoding words on a page, connecting sounds to print to speech, and segmenting would actually help us with spelling there. And another key characteristic of effective phonics instruction is really looking at that approach to introducing new sounds as I'm going to introduce a sound spelling. So not starting with the letter. And if we are, we want to make sure that we have that word play involved here. To say, boys and girls, we're going to learn about the sound today, right? And then I'm going to ask my students to repeat the sound, maybe hear some words with at the beginning, middle, and end. It's all done orally, not connecting it to print yet. Even having interactive games to see, hey, who's hearing this sound in words, right? If I'm looking at these sound riddles and a child gives me the word red as the answer, are they really hearing the sound? So having a way to determine, does my child or does this student, have they really mastered the phonological or phonemic awareness skills before, really explicitly teaching phonics? And if they're in a grade level where they're behind and I'm looking to remediate skills and they're just not catching on to my phonics lessons, this is where I need to go back, right? And make sure they can do these things orally. But from there, we want to make sure that they have opportunities to really engage in fun, interactive, multi-sensory approaches. So we can actually hear this fun, catchy song. Hopefully, maybe you needed to get up and dance.
Or you can dance in your seat if you want. That's what I was doing.
That's right. But giving your kiddos opportunities to hear those sounds in songs and words, right? So that's really all about sounds, developing phonological and phonemic awareness. Even when I'm introducing a new sound spelling, I want to start with that sound. But now we can move to that middle strand, which is decoding. And so when you're looking at your instruction that's really going to enable decoding, this is really where we'll see our instruction shift to phonics here. And so thinking about the English language, it's such a complex language. 44 sounds, 50 different ways to spell those sounds. So if you're wondering why your job as a K-2 teacher is very challenging to teach your kiddos how to decode words, that is why we actually are teaching our kids to read a really complex language, right? It would be so much easier if we just had 44 sound spellings for the 44 sounds, but that's not the case. And also we want to make sure that as we're teaching those sounds and their sound spellings, not only are we moving from the most simple or useful sound spellings to the more complex across those K to 2 years, but also that as students are learning the sounds and sound spellings, that they're given the opportunity to read and write, so decode and encode. So are they blending and segmenting those sounds, and is that transferring into writing here? And so we can really look at a scope and sequence to determine that. So obviously these two skills, as we just saw, are the foundation for developing the foundational skills that will enable everything else that comes after, right? These phonological and phonemic awareness skills we talked about in that top strand, this is a given. We can't have cracks in this. This is where we begin. But once we do make that shift to phonics instruction, then our phonics scope and sequence does need to include all 150 sound spellings for the 44 sounds taught in a very explicit, systematic way. So teaching those most basic pieces of code, maybe in kindergarten, building on those to teach more advanced pieces of code in first and second grade. So that way, when kids go on to third grade, they have the ability to crack the code. And so once we do introduce those sounds and connect them to print, obviously students are going to need explicit or deliberate practice opportunities to develop those pathways in the brain here. Remember, connecting that vision center to the speech center, and developing word awareness is really a key characteristic of effective phonics instruction. So what we see happening is these kids have built the word man, and this teacher just said alakazam, and this little boy goes up with the magic E, and we just changed that word man to main. So this is developing word awareness as students are adding, subtracting, or deleting one phoneme at a time. We can even see that with those chaining folders there. Maybe it's as I'm teaching the digraph, my students are, chaining words, like building the word at with letter cards and changing that word at to that. And then maybe it's changing that to mat, and then changing mat to map, right? Changing one individual phoneme at a time. But we also want to see students writing, right? It is more, we want to make sure they're decoding and encoding. And so dictation is another key characteristic that we should look for and more than anything, when students are actually, connecting speech or print to speech and also producing these sound spellings in words as they start with mad and have to spell the word made. We see this complexity being built here. We want to make sure that we're using this as a way to really reevaluate, have they mastered this sound spelling, right? So we can give these opportunities for practice, but we can also use these opportunities as ways to determine if they've mastered the sound spellings being taught and can they produce it. And now we'll look at that last strand in the rope and what this looks like in instruction. So we started out with phonological awareness. We've looked, in phonological awareness, wordplay, starting with sounds, not connecting it to print. Once we do move to that middle strand, it's all about decoding and phonics, blending and segmenting in tandem, making sure we have a scope and sequence that teaches all 150 sound spellings for the 44 sounds across those K to 2 grades. And the last one is sight recognition. And just as well as I know, there's a lot of misconceptions about sight recognition or sight words and those things. And so whenever we talk about sight recognition, as a reader, you all are looking at words even on this slide, and you're able to decode those words automatically, right? Without any conscious effort whatsoever, but your brain is actually decoding them at the sound level, at the phoneme level. And so we want to develop those skills in our own kids. And so regular practice and application is what's going to enable this. So let's think about fluency, right? Really lifting this off of the page effortlessly. And so in looking at your program, do your students receive explicit instruction in the code before practicing the skills in a text, in a connected text? And are students taught to attend all the sounds and words? And so if we're thinking about even that first question, do they receive explicit instruction in the code before practicing with a connected text? Well, we know based off of what the science of reading tells us is that, in looking at especially at the what to avoid, that, guessing or the 3 cueing system is not a reliable practice for decoding or lifting words off of a page. It's really not setting students up for success. In fact, it's obviously proven to be ineffective. And so if we are explicitly teaching the foundational skills and we're giving students a way to practice them, then we don't need to use level text because we're actually teaching those grade level skills and then they're going to apply them, right? It's deliberate practice to develop fluency. Also, we never want students to just memorize words with flashcards. It is about decoding at the phoneme level. That's synthetic phonics approach. And so that tells us that they're able to attend to each sound at every in every word. And so blending is going to be that primary strategy that we're going to use to actually give students the opportunity to take those sounds and sound spellings that that you're explicitly teaching, and we want them to transfer here. So if a child can orally blend it as we're teaching the phonics pieces, can they connect it to a connected text? And so one thing about a connected text is that connected text are on level text because you're teaching on level skills and they're applying them in that text to really build fluency. So this is an application piece. If we're looking at a connected text, if it is not 100% decodable and students, that means we're asking students to guess, right? And that goes back to that really unreliable strategy. And so in, looking at the text that your students are really applying their skills, we want to make sure that it is 100% decodable and that they are getting that opportunity to develop mastery. Also, when thinking about how does this relate to high frequency words? Well, high frequency words that are irregular are going to need to be, or irregularly spelt, are going to need to be explicitly taught. And also, we do know that there are some high frequency words like funny that a kindergartner may need to I recognize, but we can draw attention to the parts of the word that are decodable and maybe not yet decodable, depending on where you are in that scope and sequence. So we've just looked at the word recognition side of things, and now we're going to really look at how to develop language comprehension. And this is where Karen is going to take it away in identifying those key characteristics.
All right. And so thank you, Megan. That was great hearing all about the word recognition side of Scarborough's Rope and looking at your curriculum through those eyes. We're going to now look at that developing of language comprehension. And so what I shared earlier, we're going to look at those natural kinds of competencies that kids develop early on and continue to develop all of their lives. And when you think about, what's been happening in classrooms for decades and where we're making this shift and why it may be a challenge, is we've tried to teach comprehension as kind of that set of skills that, where you're finding the main idea or making predictions. And we look at a text and we're going to find that where that skill can happen. What happens is when what the research has told us is that doesn't transfer. And so our kiddos, if they don't have the background knowledge and vocabulary, that approach isn't going to work for them because they come to a text and they might have practiced a strategy, but they can't read the text. So we want to look at a knowledge-rich curriculum. And what does that mean when we're, looking at various aspects of what we're currently doing? And so these checks, when you look at all the checks, what are we looking for? Are there a wide variety of topics? And again, organized across content areas, building lots of rich knowledge about the world. The thing that you also want to think about is how are they designed? Is it intentional? Are we seeing things across grade levels, not just within, but across? So those transfer. That vocabulary, how is that happening where it starts early and we build on that and connect it? And again, the comprehension can be supported through that reading and after reading. Allowed to kiddos. And then again, the other thing, speaking and writing, we want kids to be able to apply those skills. Speaking, writing, reading, listening, all of those things are interconnected. And so we want you to be looking at your curriculum for those. Are those things happening? Are you writing about the topics? And as you look at those look fors, what are you asking about the curriculum that you're currently using, And I guess that's another question I have. And so Megan, going back to that question you asked about the explicit systematic instruction in your classroom, are you currently using a knowledge-rich curriculum? I'd love to hear from folks in the chat. Are you, building knowledge strategically in your curriculum right now? So
It'll be interesting to see, Karen, because oftentimes when we talk science of reading or structured literacy, I know that there is sometimes a misconception that it only deals with the bottom half of the reading robe. And so this may be a little more challenging to answer, right? Are we really using that knowledge-rich curriculum that's going to build knowledge in that systematic way?
Exactly. And so nobody's answering. I'm wondering if that means no, if it's that process of, if I'm not sure, maybe not. And that, as Megan shared, that's probably more common to see, that people aren't, because it's not easy to have a really rich, rich curriculum built on around knowledge. And so as you look at that, some look fors, well, think about that. We are sharing here a sequence of knowledge curriculum. And so you can see, if you look across these domains of instruction from kindergarten all the way up to grade 5, you can see some connections, and we've made some connections. And so, that's what you're seeing here. You're also seeing those 3 points that we just listed about multiple domains across grade levels, different topics, but we're building a breadth and depth for kiddos. You're seeing social studies, science, literature, the arts. We want kids to be exposed to that across time in a number of topics in each grade, not just a few, because they need a breadth and depth, right? And when we think about all of the things they're going to do in applying that, we encounter a lot of rich content across our lives. And the more we can build, knowledge begets knowledge. If you look at Natalie Wexler, you hear that knowledge builds on knowledge. It's like Velcro, right? So 2 to 3 weeks in each of those areas gives kids a wide exposure. And it's amazing to see how we can motivate kids with these neat topics and what they do with it once they are, immersed in it. And so as we move on, it's really about equity. And when you think about that the high quality instructional materials in your classroom, and those, and as we've said, maybe there are folks that aren't exposed to that kind of curriculum, but it's about making sure all kids have access to it. Too many curricula assume that the kiddos enter the classroom with a lot of knowledge or knowing the same things. We can't assume that, and we want to build on, we want to celebrate kids' experiences, but we also know it's our responsibility to continue to build on that and bring that world into the classroom for all kiddos to access that. And how do we do that? Or why do we do that too? Because we know that our kiddos are having so many different entry points. And this research from Tom Stitch shows us that to help all kiddos, we want to capitalize on that listening comprehension. When you look at this graph, you see that listening comprehension far outpaces reading comprehension until about the age of 13. So reading aloud to kiddos every day is a totally effective use of time. And it's an equitable, age-appropriate way to give kiddos access to that. As we move,
Karen, I have to tell you,
sure,
your favorite podcast or your one you love talking about.
Yep.
She just hits this so well. And I love to hear you talk about it. I think it's so important, especially with that read aloud component.
Definitely. And yes, Dr. Sonia Cabell from the Florida Center for Reading Research, if you haven't heard her, because we've interviewed her on the Amplify podcast series, but she's also been interviewed with the International Literacy Association. And she talks about that top half of Scarborough's rope and how important it is from early on to develop that knowledge through those rich read alouds, because kids are capable of listening. And we know that, as they grow, we are going to have reading in front of them, but we still want to read aloud to them. I love hearing people read aloud, a really nice story being read. And so we want to capitalize on kids' listening comprehension and provide that. We want to build, really lifelong learners. And that's how we do it, to build that knowledge and build that vocabulary. And that's really, in terms of what's happening for our kiddos, we can do it with images while we're reading aloud to kids. We share images. It's like holding those pictures up in a book. Kids are going to talk about that. And again, everyone has access to this. It's equitable. And so all of my kiddos can talk about this as I'm sharing a wonderful, rich read aloud. And in that same way, we can do a lot of fun things with it. We can share videos, and we've got videos with, and again, this is an insect domain. I'm going to explore a little bit. Those last images were the insects, and we're going to take them to a beeswax hotel where they're going to learn about what happens with a solitary insect meeting the social ones, the honeybees and the grasshoppers. And so those things are going to be a part of our instruction because we can build knowledge through a variety of ways. And so, I'm going to go back to another researcher, Megan, before I hit vocabulary too, is, Robert Pondiscio talked about, and if you haven't heard him, he's great. If you're not building knowledge, you're not teaching reading, because you can do that. And that's what we should be doing, building knowledge. And how do we also support that? Through the vocabulary. Kids are going to hear great vocabulary. And, we want to have that vocabulary, tier 2 vocabulary. If any of you are familiar with Isabel Back and Margaret McKeon and Linda Kukian, that work, that tier 2 vocabulary focus for the high utility, high transferability vocabulary, looking at student-friendly definitions and multiple exposures. And so I would tell you to try to include that, look up their work, look up Isabel Back's work, Bringing Words to Life. That's the name of the text as you're looking at your curriculum. In this case, you're seeing vocabulary that comes from a read aloud. You're seeing that tier 2 vocabulary. We're going to learn about the solitary and social insects, and our kiddos are coming to us at a much different level. We know that, kids should be writing with this vocabulary because they're hearing it and they can use it. Just because they can't decode it, they can use it, they can write about it, they can speak about it. Again, that goes back to that receptive and expressive vocabulary, because they'll be writing about it. And it's really neat to see kids write about it and apply that. And then as we move on and think about, how do we have them apply it with word work lessons and writing about it? In this case, we're going to have an insect journal where kids are going to use that vocabulary in the writing that they're doing about the topics that we've been reading about, whether it's insects, or whether it's 5 senses, or whether it's the Civil War, whatever we're reading about to kiddos, Shakespeare, any of those topics that kids are learning more about, we're going to have them write about it, because that really was where that kind of rubber meets the road, where our kiddos are going to apply that. And again, those little word work lessons are going to apply that knowledge with that vocabulary and have kids use it. And so Isabel Back, like I said, the basis of the word work lessons is getting kids using the words and applying it to their own lives, internalizing that vocabulary. Now, the next thread, language structure, it's that sentence level comprehension. We have to have kids understanding what's happening for the big picture of that text comprehension. And so we're going to look at, are they analyzing those sentences to understand text meaning? Because we know so much of that is happening in the sentence level. Does instruction have grammar, syntax, so that kids can see that or hear that in the reading and then apply that in the writing? And so when you see it in the examples with the insects, look at the word comb. You've got 3 pictures of comb here. We should have hidden the word comb and had you guess what the multiple meaning word is. I'll bet you could do it. I have teachers do that kind of thing every once in a while. But we're going to have kids apply that, because multiple meaning words are another thing that hold kids back, putting it in different contexts. So kids are going to walk through that. Excuse me.
So, and you know what, Karen, hopefully you can take a sip of water. I know she gets really excited to talk about vocabulary, so she probably just took her breath away, but she's exactly right. And this is actually really building that, giving students that rich content to actually apply and learn more and deepen their understanding of the multiple meaning words you see here, and connecting it to a topic that is so fun and exciting for them. Oftentimes we don't get to these science or social studies topics within our day. And so, these are really lessons that kids actually love and are so engaged in, because we're bringing the world to kids, as Karen mentioned.
Exactly. And Megan, and that continues on with other language development. In this case, we're looking at syntactic awareness activities. if you've listened to William Van Cleve talk about the integration of grammar with the curriculum so that it's not in isolation, here we're going to talk about adverbs and how grasshoppers how are their wings moving? Are they moving quickly? Are they moving slowly? So we can include that kind of discussion, but it makes sense to kids because it's all about the insects. And so it's a lot of fun for them. And so we provide those kinds of teacher guidance for that. And hopefully that's what you're seeing in your curriculum, where you're integrating that grammar because that language structure is so important. That then builds into verbal reasoning. When you think about what is left out of the conversation with kiddos in terms of those read alouds, and is there the focus on that content, because authors leave out a lot of information, and are they being supported in terms of the analysis of that content with the types of questions that you'd ask or any kinds of graphics that are going to support kiddos? Because we know that there are things like idioms and metaphors and all that kind of language that's also going to be having to have kids really analyze and think about what is the text meaning, that the inferences that are made that they can't always understand. And so the last one, that last thread is really about literacy knowledge. And, does the instruction call attention to various story structures? Are we using information and literary text, different types of text in our read alouds for building that knowledge? Different text types. When you think about that, are we helping kids navigate that when they are looking at the understanding of that comprehending that text? And so when we write about that, that's going to help us help them. And in this case, we're having them write an informational narrative because we've read them stories. And again, this happens from the insect's perspective. And then we're going to have them, mimic that. And we're going to support them with various types of writing to support that literacy knowledge as well. And within that, we're connecting morphology. So, in terms of, especially as we get into the upper grades too, when we think about morphology and how that takes a greater emphasis in the standards, as well as, in Scarborough's rope, when all those threads become really bound together, tightly bound, and kids are having that productive struggle of analyzing and navigating text on their own. We want to help kids do that. And we can do that through various domains and word study. Through, you can see the difference, incomplete and complete metamorphosis. What a simple example to just talk about what does IN mean as a prefix. And so we can highlight those things in the instruction. And so, as we hope you see these things in your curriculum, or as you're looking at new curricula, be thinking about those things because they really are going to help kiddos develop all of those language competencies to become proficient readers. And we hope we shed some light on that for you in terms of what you'll look for or what you're thinking about in your own curriculum, how you can add to what you're doing currently.
And Karen, you are so right. It's all about kind of gaining a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of more knowledge than what you came here with. Really being able to transfer that into your current practices or kind of where you want to go with your instructional practices based off of your new learning. And so what I am dropping in the chat is this Science of Reading ebook that we've really used today to guide our conversation. Also throughout today's conversation, you really got to hear about the Science of Reading, the podcast, which is definitely something that Amplify has really, we've really become a thought leader in the science of reading space. And that's why we're even here today, right? And want to spread the good word. I always talk about spreading the good word about the science of reading, empowering teachers to really learn about the research from experts in an accessible way. And the Science of Reading podcast does that in such an engaging manner. So whether you're on your drive to school in the morning, or maybe it's on the way home, or I know for me, it was like, I'm going to soak in the tub and this is where my knowledge building happens. Yes, thank you so much, Brittany. And I have learned so much as well from so many experts, so many of which we referenced today. So if you are not already a subscriber, definitely look us up. I did drop in Sonia Cabell's, and I actually spelled her last name wrong, podcast here. That was a typo. Podcast here in the chat. And if you just click on that, you can go and subscribe. Lots of listeners and lots of excitement. Also, something here at Amplify we have is a Facebook group, Science of Reading the Community. And so if you aren't already a part of this, we definitely want you to join, because this is actually where you can join in with other educators who are on this same journey as you and really hear from them and their experiences. Maybe it's sharing a new resource. But with that being said, we want to thank you all and also ask you, open up the floor for questions. And the feedback in the chat was phenomenal. And so we're so grateful for that, but also wanting to make sure we respect your time too.
And we know you've got another, I think it's a live session at in 9 minutes. And so we want to give you a chance to use the restroom, get another cup of coffee, get something to eat.
Yeah, and Jennifer asked, until what grade do you recommend decodable text? And so that's a great question. And going back to word recognition and the purpose of what a decodable text is actually doing, it's really giving students that opportunity to apply the foundational skills that you've explicitly taught beforehand. And so that purpose of the decodable text would be to follow that phonics scope and sequence. So if you're teaching at, a K-2 school or a K-5 school, and your K-2 scope and sequence is really where you would want to begin to make sure that you're explicitly teaching all 150 sound spellings across, for the 44 sounds across those grade levels. And so that would really kind of be where you would use that decodable text, especially as we think about, the reading rope or Scarborough's reading rope. And where that shift really happens with the integration of strands when using knowledge-rich content to actually teach ELA standards. And so if you have, if you're a K-2 school, I would definitely recommend using decodable text or connected text that are 100% decodable, because to give students that opportunity for mastery up until that point, making sure you're covering all those sound spellings. But if you are, if you're a 3rd or 4th grade or 5th grade teacher who's trying to remediate skills outside of your core grade level instruction, then you may want to look at, okay, outside of my core grade level instruction during tier 2 time, I'm going to really provide targeted remediation about, towards focusing on those specific sound spellings that students are missing. But I also need to give them a way to apply it too, as we're remediating it. And so you may want to look at using a decodable text in that scenario outside of your core instruction.
That's
Jennifer,
great.
I hope that's answered your question. And Karen, if you do have anything to add on.
No, I think that totally answered her question. I mean, did a fabulous job answering that. And we all, the ultimate goal is we want kids on grade level text, right? We want kids in the Lexile band of their grade level. And so that's going to get us there, using those decodables to apply. And Megan, it's application of those skills, right?
Absolutely. And, it goes back, what you just said is so important. We want students reading grade level text, and that really starts from the get-go in K, making sure we have an aligned scope and sequence or a systematic scope and sequence across those foundational years. And so that is something that really, that just can't be in your classroom only. That kind of has to be across those foundational years for sure. And so the other thing I wanted to add was, in looking at decodable text, and Brittany, I'm not sure, I think Brittany, you were the person in the chat who said, we're using these listening and learning domains. Those look familiar. And so if you want to, I don't know if our participants today, she's like, yes, that's me. I don't know if our participants today can actually come off of mute or not.
I don't think they can. No, I don't think
Brittany,
they can.
what I will say is this. I know what you're using, because as a former classroom teacher, I actually use the listening and learning strand to break into using a core program that's grounded in science of reading practices. And so that listening and learning strand was actually the original knowledge component of the Core Knowledge Foundations program that they developed. The other piece of that is the foundational skills piece, and that is an engaged, you can access that skills piece on Engage New York's website. That is actually the original curriculum that was written by the Core Knowledge Foundation that is currently known as Amplify CKLA. So we've actually partnered with the Core Knowledge Foundation to continue to enhance and further develop that program, or Amplify CKLA. And so that is where I would say, look, if you're doing the knowledge piece and look at your phonics scope and sequence, maybe it's worth really implementing skills. And if you're looking to really have all of those materials, within across your school or district, that's something we can definitely help you with. It was a link for the ebook. It was the ebook in here. Just the ebook. This is what we use to guide this presentation. And if you want to learn more, all of our instruction actually came from Amplify CKLA that we did embed within here. So if you do want to kind of learn more about what that actual application looks like in high quality instructional materials, you can definitely reach out to our team. And I'm not sure if we want to direct them to our Amplify CKLA landing page, or if Mindy has any recommendations as to where we can, help them learn more about those, receive some samples to see some of that instruction or further this conversation, but it's definitely something that's worth looking into.
And I think that they can get that through the Reading League, through their conference information.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm not sure. And maybe Mindy.
Yeah. And it looks like, I'm sorry, Karen, what were you?
I was going to say, we can put, isn't there a CKLA at the email address if they need that? I think it's.
Yeah, we'll drop that in the chat here. Also, we do have another question. And you know what? I can actually put my email in the chat just if someone does want to, and we can go from there. And Karen, if you want to as well. But we have this question, and I don't think it's off topic at all, Jennifer. I think this is totally on topic. Wondering what your thoughts are on independent reading time in grades 2 to 5. That includes free choice of books, need to have instruction, or is it better use of teacher and student time? And so what are your thoughts, Karen?
And I'm sorry, I was switching your name into because everyone didn't get your name. It was, so I switched that. I heard the words independent reading. All I can tell you what I think about that is kids should be doing as much independent reading as possible. And we want to expose kids to a wide variety of topics through that independent reading. When you're working on building this knowledge, I'd have all kinds of books in my classroom. And I know Megan's got a young son, and she knows that I had a young son who's now 23. So we make lots of comparisons. Our kids are so motivated by these topics they're learning in school. They want to come home, and if I've got an adult, when I used to surround my son with adult rock books because he was so into rocks and all different types of geology that he just would pick up anything. And so independent reading, it's all about motivation too, right? We need to motivate kids, and the motivation through these wonderful topics is motivation alone. So I didn't quite hear the question, and I should go back to read it.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we do address this because you are so right. Independent reading is such an important aspect of developing a confident, capable reader. But at the same time, if we're talking about core instruction time and really how to use that core instruction time, we definitely want to look at these practices or these instructional shifts that we went over today to make sure we're using that during our core. And I will say this, and it's kind of piggybacking off of what Karen said about the language comprehension or the knowledge building piece. One thing we get asked often is there independent reading time built into your core program? And when we think about core, that is the teacher teaching those grade level objectives. But the crazy thing that ends up happening as a result of this and the exposure of rich worldly content is that students who otherwise they wouldn't even know these topics existed at those grade levels. Right. So the last thing they would think to do would be to become interested in a topic like insects or, early American civilizations. Whereas kids who do use Amplify CKLA, that's what they go and check out at the library during their library time. And so how are we really fostering or facilitating a love for reading through exposing students to topics that they are going to grasp onto? Especially, I think about, second grade boys who are kind of crossing that threshold of like, do I really want to read about these topics, or am I really interested in science or social studies? Girls as well. I think about, we just had feedback about the fourth or fifth grade teachers we were working with, Karen, about how their boys have never loved to write, right?
Yep.
And you think about that independent reading and how that transfers into writing. Well, they're so immersed and engaged and curious about these rich topics that I know I didn't really know about, these
Right.
historical and science topics, that they love it. So that's a great question. Definitely not off topic. We want to make sure we're using that knowledge rich, coherent curriculum. So that way we do expose students across K-5, especially 2nd through 5th grade, give them those opportunities for independent learning, outside of that core block.
Your librarians will tell you that kids are coming to the library wanting, they don't know what you're teaching, but when the kids come and ask for these topics, then they find out what you're teaching because they can't keep the books in stock. So it's really neat for that, because again, it's about motivation too. We want kids to want to read.
Absolutely. And it looks like, are we right at time?
Yeah, we are right at time. So I think we probably should, and some people have popped off. And so you want to get to your next session.
Yeah.
We had so much fun today. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. And thank you, and enjoy the rest of your sessions and learning. And please reach out to us should you have any questions or would like to learn more about the instructional materials, the high quality instructional materials you saw today.
And I want to say, we hope we see you in person the next time. We prefer to be in person and meeting you and just hearing from you, seeing smiling faces.
Maybe we'll see. Yeah, for sure. For sure. And see you later, everyone. Have a great evening.
Bye, everyone.